Hello there friends, welcome to another video on Social Science Research Methodologies course. The subject of this presentation is History of Research Ethics. In this presentation, or, I will present overview of research ethics in objects versus human subjects. I will provide historical development information about research ethics involving human subjects. And lastly, I will briefly explain the ethical codes of conduct that are implemented by the institutions today. So let's begin. Why do research ethics really matter? Let's look at some of the definitions by the Department of Health and Human Services, which defines that a human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator, either it's a professional or a student, conducts research to obtain data through intervention or interaction with the individual or identifiable private information. So the ethics are aimed in to prevent any harms of psychological, physical, legal, social, economic nature to an individual. Research involves human subjects. It's important that a researcher or investigator is fully aware of a set of ethics, morals, and procedures that are defined and are established to protect subjects of any type of harm that involving psychological, physical, legal, social, or economic harm to an individual. So, with that in mind, a researcher needs to understand that all these arms are actually guided by a set of general principles that revolves around voluntary participation of human subjects in your research, informed consent, beneficence, uh, respect, and justice. While voluntary principle requires that the researcher make sure that their human subjects are voluntarily participating in a research. The informed principle makes sure that the human subject is fully aware of the type of research or study that's being conducted on him or her. The beneficent principle is for the researcher to understand that it's important that his or her research has more benefit than harm, and its benefit outweighs the harm. And the respect principle is the respect for dignity of the human being on about whom the research is being conducted. And justice involves overall fairness in the study or research being conducted. On the other hand, we have non-human subjects, which could be a project that does not involve research on a human subject or clinical investigation as defined on the other page. Some of the example of non-human subjects could be case reports, program evaluation, markets, business, or pretty much anything that involves objects or any subject that is not human. Even while conducting research and study on non-human subject, it's important to consider the general principles of informed consent to from the person to whom the object belongs to, privacy and confidentiality protection to make sure that the object of research is kept confidential and private, and lastly, that there's a sound a design or that there's a procedure in other words, a set of um, effective procedures and protocols are followed while designing that research framework. Now let's look at the historical development of research ethics to understand why we are here. Why do we have a series of important uh, research ethics that controls and governs human subject researches, both in academic and non-academic realms. So to begin with, I would like to provide example of the Nazi human experimentation. This was a series of medical experiments on prisoners that was conducted by the Nazi Germany and their concentration camps, mainly between 1942 and 1945. Again, the experiment was conducted by the Nazis on prisoners without their consent. And the research actually involved a series of experiments and studies that were very dangerous to, that were life-threatening to the human subjects, including injecting seawater into the blood of into the bloodstream of the human subjects, drowning the human subjects in cold water, or conducting a series of other life-threatening medical experiments on those prisoners of war who were being used as experimental human subjects. The Nazi physicians perpetuated a series of oppressive, uh, uh, torturing experiments on these prisoners, including forcing the prisoners into participating in these experiments without their voluntarily consent and without any informed knowledge of the experiment. The physicians would conduct the experiments without applying any anesthesia, which in many cases resulted in the death of the subjects, as well as in trauma, mutilation, permanent disability, and 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 a series of other severe and life-threatening consequences. So as a result, the Nazi war criminals were brought to trial, which is called the Nuremberg trial, and also the Nuremberg Code was established in 1948. This was the first international document on human subject research that uh, that focused on the two main principles of human subject protection, which was voluntary participation and that the benefits of research must outweigh the risks. Another historical development of research ethics involving humans that that's worth to mention is the Tuskegee experiment. The Tuskegee experiment, which began in 1932, was an embarrassing and also oppressive experiment that in which all ethical and moral human values were violated. Uh, so in this experiment, around 600 African American men were enrolled in the project, and the syphilis experiment project, which aimed to study the full progression of the syphilis disease. The violations, there were a series of violations that were perpetuated by the medical care experimenters, among which the most important one was that the subjects were not made informed of their disease. The subjects were denied penicillin medication that was scientifically proven as a cure back then. And lastly, subjects were forced into receiving experimental treatments, which were not known as the cure, or which are not uh, approved as the main cure for syphilis. So as a result, hundreds of human subjects died, and once the story broke in the media, and it prompted public outrage, the experiment was shut down. And as a result, the National Research Act was passed in 1974, as well as the National Commission established ethical procedures that went on to lead the Balmont Report. And the Balmont Report concentrated on the three general principles of respect, justice, and beneficence. So today, the scientific world, in order to avoid the repeatance of um, the historical violations in the past, which led to the development of standard procedures and protocols, not to happen again today, the scientific community has established protocols and procedures that mainly revolve around human rights and dignity. These principles make sure that that participation of human subject in a study is voluntarily informed and that is safe from any type of harm to the subjects. And therefore, Each institution wherein a research takes place holds to a set of protocols and codes that need to be strictly adhered to and implemented by the researcher. So today, before a researcher starts to conduct a study or experiment that involves collecting data from humans or involves conducting experiment on humans, that researcher needs to submit a proposal to the institution review board that actually reviews and checks the research design, the ethics, the codes of contact that the research is regulated by, and make sure that all those standards and ethical protocols and procedures are met before the IRB issues an approval for that research. And generally, researchers are based on these five main principles of ethics that are informed consent, voluntary participation, anonymity and confidentiality, beneficence, and communication integrity. I will explain all of these principles and details in the next video. Thank you for your time.